definitely humans will be selling to humans in 5 years, but like the less complicated use cases, like sales use cases, will start being picked off bit by bit by bit.
Sterling, tell them about the pitch you saw.
I'm sure you've seen it. It's flipping back and forth between a deck, and I'm like, okay.
And
Better qualification, better discovery, better CTAs. I'm like, okay, this is fascinating. So I'm curious, like, how that keeps evolving. Okay, before we even introduce you or anything, I want to ask you the question that's on my mind. Are humans selling to other humans in 5 years?
Which is another way of saying, does any of this even matter, what we're about to talk about?
Yeah, and if you, depending on how you answer this, we'll just wrap it up.
Yeah, I mean, I think that definitely humans will be selling to humans in 5 years, but like the less complicated use cases, like sales use cases, will start being picked off bit by bit by bit. Like you're already seeing that around inbound SDR behavior can largely be automated by, AI-driven qualification, what have you. Right now it's textual. I'm waiting for the verbal ones.
Sterling, tell them about the pitch you saw.
I'm sure you've seen it. Like we're sitting on pitches where you have the avatar and you're interacting completely in a voice format. One Mind is the one that I'm thinking of right now. It's flipping back and forth between a deck, and I'm like, okay.
And
Better qualification, better discovery, better CTAs. I'm like, okay, this is fascinating. So I'm curious, like, how that keeps evolving.
Yeah, I mean, my hypothesis is that insofar as LLMs can do are oftentimes higher reliability, typically are higher reliability than junior sales or junior sellers, then that will lead to better outcomes, right? Like you're a former sales leader, you ran a sales organization at Clearwater.
During the Lincoln administration, yeah.
Yeah, so driving compliance and consistency and repeatability with humans is hard because humans are error prone, but they are persuasive. And so the LLMification of that can kind of achieve both. Now, I think that what won't go away, or will be the last thing to go away, will be the founder-led component of it, where essentially
good segue, Pete.
You are solving, like you're creating the recipe that then becomes, LLMized, or in the case of like pre-AI, that is the thing that gets inserted into the brain of your first seller, your incremental sellers, or what have you.
So it's almost like once you've got something that can be repeated, then the technology can become incredibly useful, incredibly scalable. It's not really going to innovate or figure it out for you. Is that fair?
That will happen later.
Okay.
Probably.
It's actually a perfect segue. You didn't mean it to be this, but it's a perfect segue because we are excited to talk to you, Pete, because as many of you have probably read, we're here with the famous author of Founding Sales. I know you're laughing because you're a humble guy, but there's not many books that have made it into like the canon of early stage startups, and especially in the tactical canon. And I think you literally are now distributed to every YC company, or almost every YC company. This book kind of gets out.
and South Park Commons give them out to their batches.
So like thousands of founders have probably read this book at this point. And so we're stoked, Sterling and I are stoked to be here with Pete. I think we definitely want to hear your story, Pete, and you and I have known each other for about a decade, and that's important, but I really want to give people like a 45-minute boot camp on founder sales. I want them to leave this podcast and think like, holy shit, I just learned 30 things about selling that I did not know before thanks to Pete. So that's the goal of the convo, and hopefully we can accomplish it. Does that sound good?
Cool. They can listen to it at 2x and get a boot camp, or alternatively, they can just go to foundingsales.com, and like the entire book is available online. Like you can buy a Deadwood copy if you want, but like the whole book is available also for people to consume.
Great. So they can get the full book, they can get the online, or they can do the audio version through this podcast.
There you go. Right at 2x.
Okay. So Pete, before we get into the boot camp section, I do think context is important. I mean, I've known you since you were at Talent Ben, you sell this business, you're at Monster, and you started a group, Modern Sales Pros, that I was a part of when I lived in the Bay Area. Sales seems to be in your DNA. It's almost like you're calling to help founders do this. Like, where does that come from? Tell us a little about your background. Why'd you start doing this stuff?
Totally accidentally, as a result of like running into the wall of software doesn't sell itself.
Yeah.
So my background is as a business generalist founder. I was a baby product marketer and product manager at VMware now almost 20 years ago. And when I started my first software company, Talent Bin, which was recruiting software, I quickly figured out like, oh, I guess this like software doesn't sell itself. So I suppose that's somebody's responsibility in this organization, or I guess it's going to be my responsibility. And so at the time, my reaction to that was, okay, well, I'll just read the documentation on how to do this. And so when I went to look for the docs, they didn't seem to exist. And so at the time, that was kind of like, oh, okay, well, there's no canonical book on this. Obviously, there was, predictable revenue, other
Aaron Ross's, right? It's like
Aaron Ross's
Bible at the time.
Yeah, but it's more about pipeline generation. There's a bunch of other books as well, like where there's
Well, his breakthrough was the SDR, BDR specialization, right?
That's right, which makes a lot of sense being at Salesforce. Having a cloud CRM allows you to abstract the pipe gen motion from the closing motion. Anyway, yeah, great approach, but it doesn't actually solve the problem of, okay, how do I sell this thing? How do I figure out like initial ICP? What's the right messaging? What's the initial sales motion? It's almost like, Balaji Srinivasan talks about the concept of the idea maze in startups. I like to think about it as like I call it like the path through the forest, right? And that's where you're trying to figure out early on when you're founder selling. And so unfortunately the documentation didn't exist. So I was like, okay, cool. I guess I'll just figure this out. First Round Capital was an investor of ours. They run a very substantial CEO community that has since kind of like grown to other operators in their portfolio. And so a bunch of other founders kind of coached me up on these, like Angus Davis, he's now a Foundation Capital, but eventually became a point of sales company. So Sean Black, who was previously the head of inside sales at a company called Trulia. He was a founder of Sales Crunch, an early ClearSlide competitor. And these folks kind of coached me up. And eventually I figured out, our initial sales motion, hired a bunch of sales reps, got them onboarded, figured out operationally excellent, go to market. And eventually the company was acquired by Monster Worldwide in 2014. We got acquired. We were probably run like a dozen sellers or so. And then I was responsible for new product sales at Monster after that. And so after that whole thing happened over like a period of like 4 or 5 years, I kind of went back to the drawing board and said, okay, well, this documentation didn't exist previously, still kind of needs to exist. I guess I'm well positioned to write this. I'll write this.
So what year did you write it? How long's it been out?
I don't know. It felt like it took 20 years to write. So I started writing it, probably wrote it over the ensuing couple years, probably wrote the first 90% in like 2 years and then the second 90% in like another couple years. For the longest time, people will always come up to me and be like, oh my gosh, I had founding sales when it was just a Google Doc.
Yeah.
Right. So
I actually remember your Google Doc. You shared it with me.
It was hysterical. So like I was writing it and like incremental chapters would just be incremental Google Doc pages. And like you'd pop in there and there'd be a bunch of anonymous emus in there and people would be in there. And so finally I finished the last 2 chapters and then eventually made hard copies in 2020, just on the other side of COVID.
Okay.
I want to say. Yeah, so the hard copies only existed then, but the funny thing is like, book is like software, right? So the minimum viable versions of it, the early MVPs of it had been around, kind of subsequent to like 2016, 2017, 2018.
Cool. All right, so I think this is the meat of the convo, and the way I would frame it up is I think Sterling and I are just going to pepper you with a bunch of questions, and I want you to treat this like a boot camp. Like you've got us 45 minutes. We're seed stage founders, which are the bulk of our listeners.
Okay.
And we don't know how to do this stuff. We want to learn from Pete at the foot of the master how to figure out founder sales. So maybe the first way to frame it up, and you can take this wherever you want, is what are some of the mindset shifts that early stage founders who may be technical by nature need to get into to even approach this topic?
Yeah. So I think the high order bit, first and foremost, is that you can do this. Because a lot of people are like, I can't do that. They have a bunch of kind of misconceptions.
Yeah, I'm an engineer. Sales is a foreign language. Like, I can't do that well. I need to hire someone.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the response to that is that this is all learnable. It's just a skill that requires, pushes people talk about things like, oh, there's like born salespeople or what have you. To a certain extent, you'll have people who are better at like empathizing or communicating or storytelling or kind of conceiving of like a theory of mind of their counterparty. Or maybe they just grew up with 5 siblings.
Yeah.
And like they've just been doing that their entire as they were growing up, right?
Yep.
So the point is that you can do it as a founder, and that's the first and foremost thing that. Sorry, not only can you do it, the other thing that you have to kind of wrap your mind around is like probably you're the only one who can do it.
Okay, so there we go. Because my pushback's like, yeah, sure, I can learn it, Pete. I buy it. I buy it that this is a skill, but should I, or shouldn't I just hire or get a co-founder, like go get a head of sales to do this early on? And what's the answer to that? Why should I do this?
Yeah, and the reason why is because founder selling is an extension. Like I like to say that it's weaponized product management.
There we go. Yep.
It's a very different behavior than like repeatable selling, where a recipe is already baked, and now what you're doing is you're ensuring that other people reliably repeat this recipe. Instead, it is the creation and debugging and like false starts associated with that recipe. And the founder is in the best position to do that because one, they should have best intimacy associated with like the problem space because of all the customer interviews and kind of market comprehension they have. And then also they are closest to the product as well. And so those two things, that is not replicable by someone who is not the founder. And so getting the person who has those two preconditions to be able to sell is a higher probability bet than getting somebody who doesn't have those two things but can sell to get expertise with respect to this.
So, question for you here. And by the way, totally agree. And I also would say that for those early founders, this is the very best product feedback you can
Yes.
ever get because you start
Yeah.
getting led by the market. So these two things that for some reason we think of them as separate, and it's because the bigger the company gets, the more separate they start to look and feel, which I also think is wrong.
Yeah.
But it's good because it's good for the product and you start getting led by the market. But
Totally. You're
the
totally right.
question is, do you think that like selling motion could be sort of detached from the demand gen motion? Like if the founder is mostly doing product, mostly building, mostly whatever, could they come in at the end and behave more of like a closing role and somebody else can tee up the stuff? Or do they need to be doing the full pipeline management? Or what would you say there?
This is the answer to this is kind of related to the AI question you guys were asking earlier, which is the demand gen can be abstract, is probably one of the things that can be abstracted off first. But when you're first doing it, even the demand gen at the very, very top of the funnel, where the first sentence hits the eyeballs of the prospect, and they make a quick decision like, oh, this is interesting to me. Or, oh, this is not interesting to me. This is irrelevant. The founder also has to be intimate with that as well. Now, you might be able to package that up sooner, whether it's like outbound emails or like ad copy or what have you, such that then the founder can spend their time, running between 4 customer-facing meetings a day. But early on, you have to do that. And I give this presentation a lot on, it's called Founder-Led Sales. Weird. On the maturity model. And so early on when you're doing, there's actually a graphic in it that is a org chart where it's piped, or it says it's lead gen, selling, and then success, right?
Yep.
And so early on the founder does all 3. So the first one is, do we know this problem exists? Do we have a validated problem? Right? Because if you don't have a validated problem, why are you building stuff? The next thing is, does this thing actually fit, like solve the problem, right? Did we put together our software and now we're actually fixing that issue? And then the next step is, will someone give us money in exchange for that? And the next step after that is, okay, cool. Can we turn the crank on this and get to repeatability? Once you get to that repeatability thing, okay, you might be able to abstract off the pipe gen component, hire an SDR, maybe it's an AI SDR these days, in order to like load up your calendar so you're repeating that recipe as many times as possible in order to get the sharp edges off of it, create the relevant documentation, collateral, demo script, discovery questions, all the sort of stuff that is important for such that when you hire your 2 account executives that you're going to insert this recipe into, they're ready to rock. But early on, you need to be
Yeah.
Like having your fingers on the metal there as well.
Oh, I've always thought too that the reason why you can't like outsource that early on is you're defining who that very first ICP is.
Totally.
You don't have a very good sense of that. Like it is weird because the more of this that you sort of pull yourself away from, the more surface area for something to break. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't find product market fit. You just pulled yourself out of a very important part of the idea maze.
Yeah, it's really well said, because I think so much of this is having all the information in a single brain in order to make the associations and what have you. So as an example, you can imagine doing outbound to a broad set of targets. So use us as an example. We probably did about 150 customer interviews early on for Atrium. It was sales operations, sales leadership. We talked to CFOs. We talked to VPs of engineering because we thought that there might be a market opportunity for data-driven management of engineering staff as well. And so we, over time honed in on sales operations leadership, sales leadership. What was interesting was we started out in like the Series A, Series B realm because we were a little bit head faked by kind of like Zurp era stuff because there was a lot of demand there. It turns out that actually our product Atrium, we make performance management software. It really sings when you get to 50, 100, 200, 400 sellers. But had we had we not been intimate with that, like we wouldn't have known that that's where it resonates, et cetera, et cetera. And then maybe you will close those folks, but maybe they will churn out on the far end, right?
So where do you start people? When you say like, hey, founder-led sales, this is the first thing you say is you can do this. The next thing you say is you probably have to do this.
Now
where do you start? Do you start with demand gen? Do you start with like what do you start doing?
Yeah, well, so the first and foremost, you have to have a product hypothesis, like where the the problem that you're solving in the market, and that actually is kind of before founding sales. That's more like Steve Blank, Eric Ries, etc. Once you have that and you've done customer discovery and you have a validated problem that you're now starting to develop software against, then the first and foremost thing we have to do is cohere like an argument, right? What I call a sales narrative to your audience to express to them, this is the problem we solve. This is why this is a large pain point magnitude problem. This is how we go about solving it. This is the proof associated. Like, this is why it's better and different than the existing solutions that you might have. And this is the proof of why this works.
So if we get to a formula, which hopefully we can get to all the steps, but we'll see on time. Step one is get your mind right, believe you can do it. Now you're saying step two is basically formulate a pitch, is what I'm hearing.
Exactly.
And a pitch is an organized narrative that includes problem, solution, why now. These are the ingredients of a pitch. And you're saying that's the next step?
Yeah, like, because that narrative and that argument is going to descend into all the different ways that you would communicate that to another person who needs to understand that this is the case, whether that's an email or
a demo
script,
a slide deck,
or slides, or an elevator pitch, or a conversation at a bar, or at a conference.
I love this point, by the way, because a lot of people think that like the story or the narrative is about marketing, and it's not. It's actually the strategy. Like, this is the entire point of your product is, and if you don't have the narrative right, you don't have anything. You actually don't have a strategy. This is much more concrete than just marketing. It's literally why you exist. And if you can't say that, then you're not in a place where you can sell.
Yeah, I mean, you just need an argument that will then hit their brain such that they say, you know what?
I agree.
I do hate Expensify.
Yeah.
It is awful.
Right.
I have always wondered why something can't just consume the expenses that I run through my credit card and automatically put those into the different capabilities. Oh, you're saying that Divi can do that for me? I'd like to hear more.
All right. So like I'm with you. get our mind right, get the narrative right. Let's say Sterling and I have nailed our narrative. We think it's pretty compelling.
Well, can I actually ask a question on the narrative? How do you know if it's like, how do you judge if it's resonating or not? Because a lot of times, the early stage founder,
think they got it.
they think they got it, or they don't know if they've got it. Like, how do you judge if you've got your narrative right, or if you still need work there before moving on?
So usually this is where leading indicators and conversion rates come in. So this is precisely why you can't step out of the pipe gen motion, because now imagine our outreach, right? So whether it's an email with a subject line, first line, or maybe it's some LinkedIn outreach or what have you, if we are reaching out to folks with the succinct version of our narrative and no one's responding to us, that probably means your narrative sucks. That's something. Like either they're the wrong person, right? Or the argument isn't landing, or what have you, right? And then the more advanced version of that is we have a first meeting, have a discovery conversation with them, and instead of responding to our conversation with, yeah, this is, you know what? We've been looking for something like this. I'd love to see more. Instead, they're like, that was nice, Sterling.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you.
Yep, or totally. Super interesting, which is like the worst.
Yeah,
like,
can you send me some information to share with other people?
You have a deck or something?
Yeah, exactly. And so and that's how you would start seeing that.
Yeah.
When I first got to Divvy, the very first thing I did was I would write 20 LinkedIn ads a day, and then I would just look at the click-through rates. And I would take the top 5 and they would graduate, and I'd write the next ones. And it wasn't until I kind of had in my head 5, I need a 5% click-through rate. I'm like, okay, that's it. And then
it's landing.
What's that?
It's landing. That one's landing.
That's right. That's landing. And then that starts to be the thing that can build your narrative. And then you start building your deck and stuff like that. But there's ways to hack, I think, if that first sentence is resonating, and then you just move on to the next thing, right?
Okay, so we've got a narrative that we like, maybe some early indications that it's resonating with people. What do we literally do next? Are we doing cold outreach? Are we sending emails? Are we doing LinkedIn messages? What's the next step in the PK playbook here?
This is awesome. We're just going chapter by chapter.
Exactly. That's what we're doing.
Usually when founders say this, I'm just like, man, come on, man, just read the book. So the next thing that we would do is we want to prospect. And what that means is identify the organizations and the people within those organizations that have this problem. So identify the organizations that have a high magnitude of this problem, right, that probably have it unsolved in an unsatisfactory way. So it goes back to our narrative.
Yep.
And then also the specific humans within those.
How many, Pete? Like 10, 100, 150? How many?
How many prospects?
Yeah. How many should we try and reach out to?
Well, I think to start out, all these things are iterative, right? And so the first thing that we would do is identify a goodly amount. It's probably not, and this is something that so there's a YC group partner, Pete Kuman, who's one of the founders of Optimizely, and so he does a lot of coaching in YC on their sales motion, stuff. And so early on, doing all these things manually, so that you can be very close to the metal.
So it's an instance of do things that don't scale, and so
totally right. And so ripping a list out of Apollo of 1,000 folks or whatever, it's gonna be low signal. You're gonna get a lot of chaff with your wheat. And so instead, if you can pick out a few hundred targets, and also this typically should descend from the customer interviews that you did. So when you did customer interviews and you were validating your problem hypothesis, that you probably winnowed down to who had the highest magnitude. I'll use us as an example. We figured that out during our customer interviews, and then those become
your prospecting list.
Exactly, right? The same way that in your customer interviews, really effective customer interviews sound kind of similar to discovery conversations, where you're asking people about their pain points, the specific pain points that you solve, how they go about it, et cetera, in order to identify gap in their current state and kind of perceived pain associated with it. So all this is to say that identifying an incremental 100, 200, 300 account targets, and then specifically the humans within the organizations. This is sometimes where people get confused. There are specific humans within organizations that are responsible
And
for
you better
solving,
find those.
responsible for solving these problems. So organizations are the ones that have the business problem, but humans are the ones who have the personal pain because they want to get promoted, or they want to
Not get fired.
or they want to get loved by their internal stakeholders or whatever. Those are the ones who ultimately make the decisions to direct organizational resources to you and buy.
Yep.
Right. But it's the organization that has the pain point.
Okay, so we're in the prospecting phase. Are these emails? And then what makes a great email? Am I calling? Am I doing LinkedIn messages? Do you have advice there? Like what? And I do think you're pretty heavy on this on Twitter, at least, on do not send slop emails. And so let's talk about that. What makes a great founder outreach?
The thing there is it's 100% contingent on your market.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I would imagine, so I love Divvy. We are customers of Divvy. And so early on, you could totally imagine going door to door in strip malls in Salt Lake City, and that would be totally okay, right? I would imagine that Toast probably early on did exactly that in Boston. It was probably cold. Hopefully they did in the summer. By contrast, if you were, wanted to do something that was phone heavy, or like you could calling on VPs of engineering about their like APM or infrastructure management, is probably a bad idea.
Mm-hmm.
Because engineers don't love a phone call.
Right.
And so that will probably be more email heavy. You can imagine, but by contrast, maybe if you're calling on is essentially prospecting. If you are engaging CROs or VPs of sales, their inboxes are dumpster fires. And so they love a phone call, right? In fact, it might be a prospect calling them. So they might be more prone to pick up. So first you have to determine what
most likely.
Yeah, what the appropriate vector is for the target audience. And then you take that narrative we were talking about before, and then we decompose it and reduce it into the thinnest amount that is going to capture their attention at that point. It also might be ad units as well, right? But the point is, I like outreach. And when I wrote Founding Sales, LinkedIn's marketing solutions weren't as developed as they are today. Now, I mean, you can target LinkedIn ads at org size, title, granularity. It's very powerful. So that can be very helpful. But finding out where the audience lives, what communication vector they prefer, and then delivering a succinct, engaging message to them that is not half-assed, that lines up to that narrative we cohered before, is exactly what you want to do. And then, of course, we iterate, right? Just like Sterling was saying earlier, if you create an ad unit that has a dog shit click-through rate, then guess what? It's not landing. Turn it off.
Yeah.
Right. If you're sending a bunch of emails and you're not getting any opens, that's because your subject line sucks. Or either subject line sucks or you're targeting the wrong humans. Don't care. And I see this all the time where imagine as with Atrium, if our big narrative is around sales performance management, raising the performance tempo within organizations. It's something that lands with CROs. It's something that lands with VPs of RevOps. It's something that lands with CFOs. It's something that lands with CEOs. If we showed up in the inbox of account executives saying get your account executives to work harder or something, that is not going to be a high open rate. Sorry, it might be a high open rate. Email,
low responses,
low response rate, or low positive response rates. That's for sure. And so I think that then you look at open rates and response rates to say, okay, does this person want a second date with me? A second date as relates to their attention? Do they think that I am worthy of incremental
time
attention here, right?
So let's go down that path. We're starting to get responses now to our emails. We've got the message nailed. The email or calls are working. The next step is a pitch or a demo or a conversation with these guys. How should founders prepare for those calls? What makes a great demo? What makes a great conversation? walk us through the next step of the sales process.
Yeah, for sure. The one thing I would note really quickly is that LinkedIn is a very viable kind of prospecting vector these days. It used to be that just recruiters and sales leaders were on there. Sorry, and marketers were on there for the most part. You're getting more and more audience on there, even founders as well. So that's a underappreciated like prospecting channel there, whether it's LinkedIn connections, et cetera. This is a superpower that founders have. Founders oftentimes don't realize this because lots of the time, like as a founder, you're getting your ass kicked day in, day out. Someone just quit, the toilet's backed up. You have to restock the kitchen, et cetera. It feels very low status. But when you reach out to target market, sometimes this is the case. Generally, it's the case, especially if you're engaging with modern organizations. This might be less the case if you're engaging with SMBs. But showing up and saying like, "Hey, I'm the founder of XYZ. I'd love to get your perspective on this." That can be very high conversion rate. LinkedIn's fantastic for this. So I just wanted to caveat that really quickly. As relates to what you were saying, okay, great. We've got maybe a meeting on the calendar here to have a conversation about this. This is where founders, you need to think about that concept of we're taking someone's mind and we're moving it from here to here. And so what are the most effective mechanisms by which we do that? Should we show up and be like, "Hi, Tyler, how's it going? Are you ready for a demo?" Probably not.
Probably a little too abrupt.
Probably a little too abrupt.
By the way, the way I think of this is, what's the point of a subject line of an email? To open the email.
Totally.
What's the point of the first sentence of the email? To read the second sentence. What's the point of the email? To get a call. What's the point of the call? To learn more. You just incrementally earning trust with the buyer that eventually leads in a marriage proposal, right?
That's right. Yes. There are worse metaphors than dating for sales.
Yeah.
Like can be very helpful. So as relates to this, what would you do in that situation? Well, first of all, approaching that conversation, you would probably think about what the conversation is going to be like. That's called pre-call planning. This is something that I talk about
nonstop
on Twitter and LinkedIn. Is the half hour before you have that conversation, you should be thinking about, how's this conversation going to go? What do I think is happening here? I know that you played baseball. I can't remember if you played football.
Baseball.
But how's this at bat going to go? Right? Who's coming up? Oh, it's a cleanup hitter, right?
Yep.
What's the situation? What's the game situation? Same with football. What's happening right now? What down is it?
Who is this person? What might they care about? Did we go to school in the same state? You're just trying to understand ways that can build bridges.
And not just that, but also specifically the parameters that align with the problem you solve. Who is this person? Oh, they're the CRO. Oh, it's the CRO of Divvy, right? Okay.
Guy's an asshole.
Easy.
Okay. It's the CRO of Divvy. Interesting. Okay, cool. How many sales reps do they have over there? Oh, I can find that on LinkedIn. Okay. Do they have revenue operations support or not? Oh, they've got 50 sellers over there and they have one sales operations manager that I can see on LinkedIn. Oh my gosh, they're probably getting eaten alive by analytics requests. They probably don't have a data-driven management harness in place. Okay, I'm not going to assume that that's the case, but I wouldn't be surprised if that ends up being, I wouldn't be surprised if they throw me a fastball down the middle right now. So pre-call planning to understand what the situation is, or form a hypothesis of what the situation is. And also part of that might be, oh, okay, cool. You're based in Salt Lake City. Okay, what's my ice break going to be? I'm going to make a joke about crumble cookies and maybe dirty soda or what have you. Wonderful. I've got my rapport build joke that I'm going to go to. I'm going to get them to laugh within the first 90 seconds of the call. We're going to do some discovery as relates to the current state of their organization and whether they have the pain points that I think that they have, because otherwise I probably wouldn't have prospected them.
And part of your point on the discovery is you shouldn't waste time on the call on discovery for things that you could have found out before the call.
Oh, totally.
Discovery should be a valuable thing that you couldn't have learned by just not being lazy.
Yeah, and the way that I like to describe a great discovery call is a thoughtful conversation between two professional colleagues.
Yes.
where like it kind of feels like you're talking about problems. You're having like a technical bitch sesh over beers or dirty sodas.
I think this is important because a lot of times if you're selling, people have viewed that as, well, I am on a lower plane than the buyer. And I think what you're saying is, no, you're just trying to discover whether there's a problem that you could potentially solve for them. And that's actually a conversation of equals. You're just trying to help or see if you can be helpful. And that's a naturally curious and equal conversation than the seller-buyer thing. Is that right?
Yeah, and this kind of comes down to a lot of the misconceptions that founders and even sellers have around like what a salesperson looks like. Showing up on, I'm going to like sell you as hard as I can and persuade you with my charisma versus like coming into it with a low intensity,
Casual.
well, and also just being upfront about it. Like, hey, Tyler, I'm glad that you took this meeting. I'm really looking forward to talking with, Utah Valley's all-star catcher
on.
from,
Yes.
from 2008.
First base, but it's a weight joke. I get it.
Oh, are you lefty?
Lefty, yeah.
Oh, there you go. See?
Knew it.
Is it gingers don't have souls or lefties don't have souls?
I think it's gingers.
Okay. Got it. So anyhow, Tyler, I'm glad that we're having this meeting right now. So, typically the way I like to run these conversations is I'm going to ask you some questions about your business and kind of how you guys go about dealing with like the utter brain damage that typically is expense categorization and all the other things that you'd rather be spending your time on. I did 30 minutes of research before this conversation. You have amazing Yelp reviews, I just gotta say. And, if it turns out that you guys have some of the things that our other customers work with us to help resolve, then there might be an opportunity for a next conversation. If not, and like you're all dialed in, like the accomplished person that I think you are, then you know what? We can part ways as friends. Does that sound like a terrible idea or are we good?
Great use of time. Let's do it.
All right, let's go. Right. And so now, right, we're going to spend 15
Low
minutes.
stakes, no pressure. Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
It is you always talk about you can smell like desperation on someone's breath and stuff like that.
Totally.
So like Tyler's making an interesting point. He's like, the first thing is in your own mind, be like, hey, if they do have a problem and I'm the solution to that problem, I'm not, subservient. And it's like, you got to create an equal playing field.
Yeah.
And then, lower the temperature in the room so guard can actually come down and you don't feel like you have to, at every turn, present a massive objection just so you can, get off the call unscathed. So I think that's obviously like very important. And like you said, everything we've talked about so far, anyone can learn, anyone can practice, anyone can do.
Yeah.
Some people are a little more natural at it than others.
But there's no black magic.
Yeah, there's no...
Peter, go ahead.
Two things as relates to practice. One of the things that I like to tell people to do is I call it like rapport push-ups, right? So anytime you're in a situation where you're interacting with somebody who probably deals with assholes all day long, if you can see how quickly you can become friends. So examples of this would be like flight attendants, customer service reps, bartenders. So people who like you typically approach and they're like shields up, you're like, all right, I'm going to see how quickly I can build rapport with them by pointing out that I like their earrings and then asking them a question about like, today's special cocktail and have them teach me. Immediately we're homies, right? And like I've differentiated myself compared to all the other people that they talk to. So, and the reason I say that is because it's a muscle and you just get good at it, right? So that's the first thing you can do. The second thing too that you commented on is if they have the problem that you have that you solve, they should welcome it. This is actually a Twitter conversation that Tyler and I had, I don't know, like 30 years ago or what have you, where some poor founder was talking about how like outbound, like I hate receiving cold emails. And it's like, no, you hate receiving bad emails.
Irrelevant bad emails.
Irrelevant, right? Non-targeted. And you had this great metaphor, which is if somebody has a broken window in their house, right? And the window repair guy is driving down the street and he sees that there's a broken window on the front of this house. And he walks up to that house and knocks on the door and says, I couldn't help but notice your front window is broken. Is that something that you've been thinking about maybe solving? Probably they're going to respond and say, yeah, you know what? It's just that I have 3 kids and I don't have time to do this, and I've been meaning to get around to that. Are you busy right now? Can you just fix it? Like, that was a sales transaction
Right.
there. But like, Tyler observed, you're the repair person in this case. Tyler observed that there was a broken window. He was like, yeah, you know what? I'm going to go and talk to one of the stakeholders in this organization, the wife or the husband or what have you. And they made a decision like, yeah, this would be super, super valuable. That was a sale.
This is the people love buying things. They don't love being sold.
They don't like being sold to, but they love buying.
But they love buying things. And maybe there's an extrapolation of the analogy because you're doing the window thing, and it's like, I don't love that the window's broken, and it's not like the first thing I'd show up to spend money on, but it's windy and it's getting kind of cold.
Yeah, totally.
Whereas, like Tyler collects baseball cards. It's like if you sent him a card, he wouldn't feel like he was getting sold. He'd be like stoked to learn about it. He may or may not buy it. But anyway, you gotta remember, people do want the window fixed. People do want to buy the baseball cards, but a lot of it comes down to like, how lazy are you? How targeted are you? How many, all of those kinds of things, right?
Yeah. So can we identify the folks that have these problems? Can we tersely communicate to them like, hey, I think you have this problem. Here's the mechanism by which we can solve it. And can they be persuaded that your approach is the right approach to solving that problem, whether it's expense management or sales performance management or fixing a window, right? I don't know about replacing the whole window. Actually, you don't have to replace the whole window. We have this magic window tape that we can deploy on this. And, it's not quite as good as replacing the whole window, but boy, howdy, is it 1/100th of the cost and I can get it done right now. And these are all of the other customers. In fact, actually, I think your neighbor 3 doors down and actually somebody over here on the next block over is using our magical window unbreaking tape. Would it be an awful idea for us to like do one of your windows? Right.
All right. So before we get into some like wrap up macro questions, how do you close these deals? How should a founder think about actually converting the interest and a good call to a paying customer? What are the best practices here?
Yeah. So in founding sales, I kind of talk about the like demo, objection, close loop, right?
Teach us about that if you can briefly.
Well, essentially, like, you have a discovery conversation. We validate that they have the problem that we solve. They believe that. Right? They're unhappy with it. It is a priority for them to solve. We present how we go about doing it. They believe that seems like a reasonable way of going about it. And they are interested in seeing how they could potentially transact with us.
Yep.
Right. So as an example, a really easy way of kind of closing on that, it's like, Tyler, based on what we've discussed so far today, this seems like this solves this problem. If we can come to agreement on commercial terms, is this something that you'd want to proceed with?
Very easy question. And my answer would be like, yeah, if we can come to commercial terms.
Missed Pete. He was just going to shut up and let you talk there for a second. Just sit there.
Oh, that's your point, is once you ask, just listen.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And if they're like, no, oh, okay. Well, help me understand why. Well, we're actually moving out of this house, so I don't really care about the broken windows. Oh, okay, cool. And then like maybe there's an objection handle associated with that, which might be like
resale value.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, I think that the other I don't know if that's actually going to be super helpful for the realtor that you're employing or whatever the case. Like address the objection, right? And then go back again and say like, oh, does that answer your question? Does that resolve that concern? Oh yeah, I guess you're right. Wonderful. Well,
now can we move forward with commercial terms? And then you wait and they may have another one. What I love about it is by moving the conversation to an actual transaction involving monetary goods, people will now actually voice their real reasons to not do something. And we used to call it kicking the pheasant. Like, you're getting people to make a decision or not. And you just have to be able to handle those things because it's natural. They're going to have questions as you come to closing terms. Okay, so I think you've taught us how to close a deal. So now let's repeat that. And I want to ask more macro quick questions is, how many times do I need to do that before I need to hire somebody, like another sales rep? Who should my first hire be? Is it a VP of sales or is it SDR? Move us to the next phase. Now that we've found founder sales repeatability, how should a founder think about scaling this? And then we'll wrap up with a couple other questions.
So the first step is getting anyone to buy,
Mhm.
right? So as soon as we've done that once, we can't declare victory because they could have just, thought you were smart and handsome,
Yep.
and they wanted you to come by their dental office more frequently to deploy the software. We actually need to get to statistical significance here. And so there's two things that's happening there. One is we're proving that this is real. And the second thing is that as you are selling incremental deals, you're mapping out the problem space of all the objections, all the kind of corner cases, all the competitors that would show up. And that's how we're mapping out the path through the forest, or this recipe. And so that's first thing is you're figuring that out, and you're the one who's going to be best positioned to contend with those issues. Second, what we're doing is we're creating assets, right? So, here I realized that the people, we were talking about this earlier, wow, people who come from, to use Atrium as an example, people who come from Box and MuleSoft and Salesforce sales leadership backgrounds are very data driven. So I'm going to put in my pre-call planning checklist to look at their background and see if they come from any of these sales organizations. Or sales leaders who did STEM undergrad are going to be more receptive toward, these are patterns that you're going to start seeing as a founder seller, and you're going to update your docs, right? You're going to update your recipe code. Or, oh wow, that's a new objection that comes up. I'm going to create an incremental slide in my appendix to jump to when somebody brings that.
And these are the assets you're talking about.
These are the assets. These are the tools that we're creating for us as the user. But then what's happening is we're not going to have this tool chain that we've created, that when we go and hire our first sellers, our first dedicated sellers, they will drop into a fully provisioned cockpit that has everything that they need. It will have discovery questions. It will have pre-call planning checklists. They will have a demo script. They will have a pitch script. They will have objection handles, all those sort of things. And the reason why was because you figured those out for yourself. And the way that you would do that is it depends on the sales cycle and the average selling price of your sales motion, but it's probably dozens. It's not dozens and dozens and dozens. You'll probably hit the top of the S curve pretty quickly there.
So you think of it in terms of number of deals rather than some ARR threshold a founder needs to take you to before
it's at bats.
It's at bats.
Yeah, it's at bats. So as an example, you see this all the time actually, where startups will jump up to high average selling price startups will jump up to very to high ARR numbers off of a couple transactions. They don't have their sales motion figured out.
Yeah.
And then they bring in professionalized sales, and it's a total disaster.
So call it a dozen or two of these that you've done.
There's a caveat there where the problem with high ASP selling, and this is kind of where my reach outstrips my grasp, is most of my experiences in mid-market selling 25, 50, 100K, 10K deals in very, very, very high enterprise ASPs. Those deal cycles generally will be 6 months, 9 months, what have you. Waiting until you have a dozen of those deals is probably not tenable for your organizational development. So that would be a smaller number of those.
Yeah.
Right. But it still has to be enough.
And then who do you hire, Pete? Do you go straight to a leader? SDRs, BDRs? I've heard you should hire 2 at a time so you can A/B test them. Do you go get a leader, a head of sales first? What do you think about growing that out? And then
So the next stage after kind of repeatability, right? Proof of repeatability on the founder-led sale is proof of seller abstraction. And so this kind of goes back to the idea of keeping in as few brains as possible. So usually the ideal situation there is to add a couple of sellers, dedicated salespeople who come from a first seller or at least early stage sales.
You don't want to go get a leader yet. You want to see if you can get a couple individuals to sell to.
Twofold. One, you don't want a leader yet. And then secondarily, the individuals that you're hiring there shouldn't come from a public scaled company background, but instead should come from, backgrounds that are used to more uncertainty and more kind of hair on the sales motion and sharp edges around the product, et cetera, et cetera. Like other startup or sellers who are coming from a sales motion and it's kind of similar category. So the example that I always like to say is when Greenhouse ATS software, when they were initially going to market, a lot of their early sellers came from Namely, right? So HRIS, mid-market HRIS sellers, et cetera. And Namely was at the time like a Series C or D startup. So going to use kind of extend the analogy there, if Greenhouse had gone out and hired sellers from like SuccessFactors or Taleo or what have you, Workday, probably would have been less than ideal. What you want is seller, like category, stage,
Seller market fit.
yeah, and sales motion match
Those
there.
those first couple reps are like special employees, and when I think about the companies I've been involved in, they generally have a number of characteristics. Like they're more sort of product obsessed than the reps you bring on later. Like they want to understand every nook and cranny. They like giving feedback to their PTO after they get on the demo. Like their brains just work a little bit differently, and then they also really get a kick out of the newness of it and saying, well, where can I vector off? They're like explorers. And what's wild, usually they are wildly important. They're beloved by the organization. And then when you get to a point where you're hiring 5, 10 sellers at a time, they flame out because they don't want to follow someone else's process, or it's just like very uncomfortable for them. They're very unique creatures. They're special, and they're very cool, but it's a very unique role.
Yeah, for sure. And that's what you want
Yeah.
for this is you want people who are bright, they're down to figure it out. Now, they need to know that this is going to be 20 customer facing meetings a week and push-ups, which is what sales is.
Yeah.
But it's also going to be figuring things out in the midst of all those push-ups as well. And so like that, typically what that looks like is a seller who is not too senior. It also might be a sales manager right now at a series, B or C company who's could flex back down to being an individual seller again. What it probably is not is it's not a seller from a scaled public sales organization,
Mm-hmm.
and it's probably not a leader from like a larger organization, like a VP of sales, like a third level leader from a series D or E or public organization who's been so distant from selling for so long that Lemkin talks about this, that like they don't want to do the work. They want to hire people
They're above
to do
the
the work.
Yeah.
Yeah, they want to hire people, they want to build a team, all those sort of things. That's cool, and like that's a skill profile, but like it's not the skill profile for this. And the other reason I'll note, the reason why you like it's an anti-pattern to hire leadership to then hire the reps is because now you're playing a game of telephone.
Mm-hmm.
And this goes back to what we were saying about having as few brains as possible.
Yeah.
You have all this information about the path through the forest and the recipe associated with your sales motion. Hopefully you've done a good job of documenting these things, but the documentation is still an abstraction. So you sitting next to the rep, and this is when you hire those reps, it's a weird situation. I have a bunch of founders that I work with who are in this stage right now, and also in the founder-led sales community that I run, where you just got good at selling, and now you're telling me that I have to like get good at onboarding and managing, hiring and onboarding these reps. This is a totally different skill profile. It's like, yeah. And now you get to debug that. Right. But that's something that can't be delegate the same way that
It's just the founder's journey. You just move from
Totally.
one thing to the next until you've figured it out, and then you can scale it. And same principle.
yes, you debug it, you figure it out, and then you package it. And then once it's repeatable, you hand it to you fire yourself and you move on
That's
to
right.
whatever the next most awful thing is that you have to contend with.
Okay, I think
You're an expert.
yeah, we've kind of covered it, right? But like before we wrap up, is there anything that you'd say that we haven't covered that we definitely should, that early stage founders need to know? We got to prospecting, demoing, qualification, closing, hiring. Anything else that you'd add that we haven't talked about?
I think a big thing, so Nick Mehta over at Gainsight has done a really good job of beating the drum on this. I think that a really critical part of the early sales motion is ensuring that people get to utility.
Time
Sometimes
to delight. Yeah.
time to delight, but there's the first delight, but then there's also, so there's a gentleman named Jocko van der Kooi who runs a go-to-market consulting firm called Winning by Designs. He has this great phrase where recurring revenue comes from recurring impact, right? So if you don't have recurring impact and recurring utilization, this is why I know someone tweets quite a bit about why product organizations need to have revenue targets. That's Tyler. People are going to churn if they don't continue to use.
Yeah, this is customer success. This is the
customer
whole point
success.
behind it, right?
It's customer success and making sure that people are implemented appropriately, getting utility, that you're instrumenting that utility, that you're getting them coming back to you saying, yeah, it turns out that this crazy divvy thing is saving me all this time with respect to my expense management. This is so fantastic.
Yep.
Right? This is so fantastic. This is wonderful. This is money well spent. I am going to be a high net promoter when other people in my strip mall that you're selling to come to me and say, hey, how's that divvy thing? I'm going to say, it's awesome. You should buy. And so that's really important for founders to make sure that happens, because sometimes you can say, oh, wow, I sold. This is great. Yay, happy dance, move on to the next thing without making sure that folks get to utility.
Success. Pete, this is awesome, man. Thanks for the boot camp. As we wrap up, 3 quick questions. I'll do the first one.
Uh-oh.
We called the IO podcast, right? This is definitely an operator side. You're giving us an operator masterclass on founder sales, but I'm curious if there's an investor, the I, that you really admire, maybe in Atrium or otherwise.
Aside from you guys?
Yeah,
Present company excluded.
present company excluded. Who's the investor you admire a bunch?
So we have an investor on our board, a gentleman named Brett Queener, who is a partner at Bonfire Ventures. He's absolutely fantastic. He's crazy in the best way possible. He previously he was very early at Salesforce. He was ran their revenue operations organization. He ran a bunch of their products as well. He then was a leader at Smart Recruiters as well, and now he invests full time in B2B software, and like he obviously has great things around early product market fit and go to market fit and what have you. He's absolutely fantastic.
Second question is same thing, but for an operator. Like, who's a founder, who's an operator that you really admire, kind of your favorite?
Well, this person, I mentioned him earlier, but I think that customer success isn't as appreciated as it should be. And the CEO of Gainsight is a guy named Nick Mehta.
Yep.
Yeah, he's absolutely fantastic. Gainsight is not a small organization at this point, but I think that he's done a really fantastic job of being the face of customer success, especially as customer success has evolved over time, and Gainsight has evolved over time to kind of like Sweetify. He's an awesome Twitter and LinkedIn follow.
Love that. Last one is, what drives you, Pete? What is it that's like your golden spur, we call it? Why are you the way that you are?
I think a lot. So my mom's a teacher. And she was a kindergarten teacher, first grade teacher, and then she was a administrator and then a professor of education. And I think I spent a lot of time doing education stuff. And I think that was part of the impulse associated with writing Founding Sales. I used to joke that a lot of the reasons why I wrote Founding Sales was like people would say like, hey, can I pick your brain on prospecting? Can I pick your brain on XYZ? And I was just like, you know what? I'm just going to write the documentation on this. And so I think that, packaging up information that is actionable, tactical, such that people can like pick it up and solve their problems faster is something that is really, that like gives me a lot of, sparks joy.
Love that. Thanks, man. This has been a lot of fun.
Very fun.
What's stoked for all the founders to hear it.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
What's cool about Pete is from the second you shake his hand to the end of like a recording, he is the same guy. He's obsessed with figuring out how to be the very best at like sales as a craft.
Yeah.
And you can tell that he's sort of applied all these different learnings throughout his journey into a very specific use case, and then he does a really good job communicating how to take action from that.
100%. If you think of of this next kind of season of the IO podcast where we want to get really tactical for early stage founders, this is just right down the fairway for this. He gives you like 15 to 20 highly actionable, very specific things that you've got to do to land your first customers as a founder. And he also teaches the why behind all of this stuff. So I just think it's a very valuable boot camp. I'm thinking of it as a boot camp for a founder who doesn't know how to do sales yet. This is where you should start. You should pick up his book. Pete's the master at it.
One other thing that's cool about Pete is, like every true domain expert, he demystifies things.
Yes.
The first thing he said is anyone can do this.
Yep.
Right? And then he teaches you. And then you leave, hopefully, feeling like, yeah, I can do this.
So drop any comments or thoughts you have on what Pete shared. We'd love to hear what you think, and we hope you enjoy this one.